In my previous videos, I argued that the US and Israel may actually want different things out of the current conflict with Iran. But before we even get to that question, I think a more basic one is, why did the US and Israel attack Iran in the first place? Now, the public explanation is largely centered on one claim, and that's that Iran was moving towards building a nuclear weapon. Now, this justification has been repeated many times by both Washington and Jerusalem. Now, obviously, we know that Iran is a major agitator in the region. We understand, it's understandable that that is part of their foreign policy. They constantly agitate with their neighbors to try and destabilize the region as much as possible, to try and give themselves as much regional strength and regional influence. But when you look at the US's own intelligence assessments going back to 2024, the picture becomes a lot more complicated. Because in 2024, the annual threat assessment, which was produced by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, so this is effectively the head of US intelligence. The conclusion was about Iran's nuclear program was very clear, and that's that Iran was not currently building a nuclear weapon. That the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had not reauthorized the nuclear weapons program to be restarted, and that was halted in 2003. Now, this doesn't mean that Iran's nuclear program itself is completely harmless. Iran had enriched uranium to high levels and had accumulated enough material that if it chose to, it could potentially move towards a weapon fairly quickly. But there's an important distinction there, in that having the capability is not the same as intent. There are many countries out there that have, that are in a similar situation with stockpiles of highly enriched uranium that just have chosen not to weaponize it for whatever reason. Now, according to the US intelligence community, there is no confirmed decision, and now this is the intelligence community of the largest military in the world. There was no confirmed decision by Iran to build a bomb. Then there is the US National Security Strategy, which is compiled by the White House. And this outlines the major threats facing the US. And when you read these reports in conjunction with the one from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the hierarchy of threats becomes very clear. And this is information is available in the public domain. China dominates the analysis, at the top as the biggest strategic threat. Russia is discussed extensively. Technological competition, economic security, and great power rivalry receive the majority of the attention. Iran is mentioned, but usually in the context of localized regional instability, proxy groups, and missile development, rather than being some sort of imminent nuclear threat. In 2005, we saw the US and Israel launching attacks against Iran, with Donald Trump saying afterwards that the US had completely obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. And yet, despite that statement, Trump justified attacks again in early 2026 by saying that the attacks were targeting Iran's nuclear program, and that Iran was close to acquiring a nuclear weapon. And at the same time, in recent press conferences, he also said that his advisors, such as Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, had warned him that Iran was preparing an attack against the US. Now, this raises the obvious question. So if the entire US intelligence community says that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and that there was no evidence of Iran building a nuclear weapon, and then if public evidence of this imminent attack against the US has not been presented, what exactly was the strategic objective of these strikes? So if the US had obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities in 2005, why the strikes this year? Which brings us back to something I mentioned in a previous video. The US strikes were almost inevitable. And the reason I say that is when you look at the amount of the military assets that the US had amassed in the region in the past weeks, with the express aim of putting massive amounts of pressure on Iran at the negotiating table, perhaps Iran was not capitulating in the way that Trump had hoped. And yes, they were negotiating, and the Omani facilitators admitted that Iran was very open in the negotiations. They were not hostile at all, and there were a lot of agreements that were reached. But I think Trump perhaps had hoped that based on the presence in the region, Iran would just put their hands up and capitulate. And then we have to remember that the US and Israel are not actually pursuing the same goal here. So for Israel, Iran represents a regional and potentially existential threat, particularly because of Iranian support for groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas. So Israel just wants and needs a significantly degraded Iran, and that secures their safety. For the US, however, the objective may be different. We know that Israel told the US beforehand that they were going to strike Iran, and the US likely felt that they needed to go along with the Israeli strikes to show solidarity with Israel, and also with the massive buildup in the region. Simply letting Israel go ahead with the strikes and withdrawing the US forces from the region would have probably been unacceptable to Trump, because in his eyes that would have signaled weakness. We also know that with the US have talked about regime change in Iran. This is unlikely to be achieved without a massive ground offensive. You have to remember that the people in Iran have been living under this authoritarian regime for the last 40 years. They're not suddenly just going to rise up against the government, which has significant capability to oppress these people and to squash any riots. The hardline regime is still very much in power in Iran when you look at the new leadership structure that's coming in after the older ones have been taken out. So when we see repeated strikes justified by nuclear concerns, it's worth acknowledging that the very real reasons for the strikes are very different to what the US are saying. It's likely that with the midterms coming up in the US, Trump felt he needed a win to signal American strength, which can be done through sustained strikes on Iran with minimal casualties.